Hello and welcome to another session of Talking Faith, the weekly devotional where Cal and I sit down with a cup of tea or a cup of coffee and just reflect over what's been happening in our hearts and minds as we continue walking with the Lord. And this week we're continuing on our session which was the Beatitudes, so we urge you to make a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, join us and just get comfortable as we continue talking faith. So Callum, what's the Beatitude that's on your mind recently?
Well, the next one that we're going to be thinking about a little bit today is blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Kind of maybe quite a classic one, I guess, maybe one that you're maybe more likely to have heard out there, with some interesting themes, I think, to unpack, particularly that big word that's sitting in the midst of it, righteousness, which is one of those kind of classic Christianese words that we love to use, but I'm not actually sure how well we understand it. It gets thrown out a lot and almost used to the point that it kind of loses its meaning a little bit in there. I guess in part because it's hard to fully define. I mean, righteousness in human terms is just kind of being morally true, being morally good. Like that's kind of the underpinning thought. If you were to describe someone as being very righteous, that would be the intent. Sometimes we also use that, I guess, nowadays to be like, if they're a bit too, like they think of themselves too piously, there's a kind of connotation that can come with it. But the actual meaning in human terms is that kind of morally good, morally right. I think when it comes to God, though, and spiritual righteousness, there's a whole bunch more going on. There's like God is the perfect epitome of righteousness in its absolute fullness. Everything of what truly moral, good character attributes can be in one being is exemplified in God. And there's this notion throughout Scripture of us becoming more like that there's this process known as sanctification, this process of being made right with God, that we would become righteous and that His righteousness is kind of granted to us in a complicated way through Jesus' death on the cross, that sacrifice allows us imperfect beings to come before this perfect being God and to be granted some of His righteousness. So there's this whole process of being made to our character changing. I think we see that reflected in this verse, to hunger and thirst to be more like God, to have His character, His attributes, the truth of who He is to become real and manifest in our lives. There's an invitation and a desire, I think, for us as Christians that we should want to be more like Him, that we should want this to come out in us and kind of be made manifest, to be made right with Him. But I think there's also, I guess, a kind of secondary part to this verse, or a secondary look. One of it is looking up to God, but the other part is looking, I guess, onto people and what it means for us to hunger and thirst to see righteousness around us, to see the world made right around us. And there's a thread of this theme of justice, I think, to be pulled from it, that we would also desire and hunger and thirst for things to be right around us, which means for justice to be present around us and to speak out against acts of injustice. And I think the church over the years has, in many ways, done a good job of that. Like there are many folk who, inspired by their faith, have done a wonderful, powerful testimony in kind of making right the things that are wrong in our world and seeing righteousness flourish more than it maybe would without them, which is important for us to reflect on. What does it look like for us to be both desiring to be like God's character, to bring out that righteousness in us, but also to make right the world around us?
Yes, so it's quite important to see the notion of people standing up for justice. We see people in Scripture doing that very same thing as well, and that gives us a sort of jumping off point. We can seek what they've done and continue to do what they've done as well. And when it comes to our relationship with God, knowing that He is working something through in us, where He's making us better, is always something good to reflect on and come back to. But you said that word, making right. Well, what does it mean for us to be able to make right maybe the relationships we have with other people, or just maybe our relationship with just the world itself?
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges for us as Christians, to seek that idea of seeking justice and to I guess, look for opportunities where we can be either a voice or support in whatever way or means that we have to make better right the world around us. And I think for me that there's two particular challenges, I guess, that come through, and I think it's interestingly described in these verses. I like the phrase hunger and thirst. In that there is both this passionate desire when you're hungry, you know you're hungry, like it's something that you're perfectly aware of. And I reflect on my life, and there are times when when it comes to justice, I know that I've been hungering and thirsting for things to be made right. One particularly that comes to mind is there was a good few years back now, there was a film that came out called Nefarious, which is a Christian film that's looking into the world of people trafficking, and a number of particularly Christian organizations who are stepping in and doing what they can. And it was trying to make people aware that there is way, way, way more of a problem than we appreciate. We think of slavery as something of the past, but the honest truth is that it's far, far from that, and actually is more of a problem nowadays than it was back in its heyday in the past. There are millions upon millions of people across the globe trapped, trafficked, and essentially in modern day slavery. And I remember when I first saw this film, I was impassioned by it. There was like a kind of, there was groups that were meeting as a follow-up, and like just, I remember this kind of sense of passion and kind of wanting to do what I could in there. I will be honest though, as time went on, sometimes that wanes a little bit. It's not I don't care, I 100% do, but you just kind of forget a little bit. The passion that was maybe there at the start wanes off, and I guess that same thing happens with hunger. Like once you get a little bit of satisfied, then it kind of wanes off a little bit. And actually there's important for us as Christians to be reminded of that, to be impassioned by that, both in our seeking God and seeking Him to transform us more into what He wants us to be, but also in seeking righteousness around us, that we would continually be reminded of that process. I think the other thing for us to remember is that just as we can bring justice around us, we can also bring injustice. Not intentionally, I don't even think any of our church would do it criminally or anything like that, but just by accident, we often hurt and harm and have a knock-on effect. We maybe just by ignorance or by not realizing the consequence, or just by focusing on what we gain and not necessarily acknowledging what someone else can lose, we can be both a source of justice but also of injustice to those around us. And I do think there's a challenge for us as Christians to reflect on, well, what does that look like? How do we avoid that? How do we seek to be people of justice, bring righteousness, but avoid causing harm or ill to those around us? Because unintentionally, the words that we use, the interactions that we have, can have lasting hurt and harm. There's an unfortunate truth, and I've never intended it, but there are people who I think probably have been hurt by my actions or my words as a Christian, and that breaks my heart. It was never in any way my intention, but it can be a reality that we bring about. And so there is a challenge for us to be aware, to be cautious, I guess, at times. There's times when we need to speak out for justice, and there are times when we need to be aware of the impact, the injustices that may be brought about by our own actions too. So a lot to think about in all of that. The notion of righteousness is one which has so many ties and threads throughout our lives, throughout our culture, throughout our society, that it can take you down many paths. But I hope in that you found something valuable to think on.
Yeah, and it's so crucial as we sort of think back, just to give ourselves a moment to actually think when we're working our day-to-day lives, how's ways we can make a righteous impact in the world. Maybe not in a massive way, maybe in a bit of a small way, but how can we make a bit of a difference? How can we make sure in our conversations we aren't hurting other people? It's a challenge, but also the great thing about God is He is with us as we seek to do this. He'll be the one that reminds us and blesses us in the process. So there's this concept that He is with us, and as we think about it, it's going to continue to grow in our hearts and in our minds, and it's something we should be seeking as much as possible. So hopefully that's been an encouragement to you today. Hopefully it gives you something to think about, and as we continue through this week, maybe something to put into action as well.